Let me just find the slides. Okay, so my goal for tonight is basically to look at the topic and explain a little bit why we are trying to make Git work with Excel. We're going to have a very quick Git refresher. I assume that all of you kind of have a distant idea, at least, of what Git is. So I'm definitely not going to go into details. But if you don't really know your way around Git, then probably you will get some impression today and might get some ideas to look for a tutorial on the internet for after the webinar. I'm also going to record the webinar, so like if you have to jump off earlier or you just get bored, then you can always get back to it on YouTube after the live webinar. The live webinar obviously has the advantage you can ask questions. Probably the easiest way is to use the chat application, but otherwise I would suggest that after the meetup, after the webinar, in the end, you could also unmute yourself. Depends a little bit on what is easier for you. And then finally, we're going to go through we're going to look at what are the issues with Git if we use Git out of the box, what's the issues if we want to track Excel files. And then we're going to look at a couple of rules that make your life easier with Git and Excel. And then we're going to have quite a few tools that we're going to look at. And then in the end, we probably have the hardest topic, which is why and how we can get into merge conflicts and then how we can resolve them. All right, so to kind of motivate tonight's session, it's always good to start with a few reasons. And this is a tweet from a couple of years ago that I believe kind of describes the issue very well. And as you can see, it's somebody who actually uses the file system to basically do a version control of their files. And by and large, I would say that's the most common way to actually manage different versions in Excel. So probably if that would be a physical meeting, then usually people would start nodding their heads when I show this tweet. So I just assume that this is the case with tonight's webinar audience too. A few more reasons, though, to why we would like to use a professional version control system as Git with Excel. So one of the reasons is that we are looking at Excel basically just as another programming language. You can do basically you program Excel by using if statements and so on in your cells, and we just say, okay, if it's code, then it's actually a good idea to also treat it as such. And Git has been battle tested. It's used for pretty much everything these days, including the Linux and Windows source code. So there is quite a bit of material about it. Git is also actually a good option for collaboration. So if you are more than just one person to work on a file, then it actually helps you to see who made a change, why they made a change, and when that was, and then hopefully also what they changed. And then you obviously also check a few boxes like the audit trail box. Spreadsheet governance programs are more and more kind of a topic in companies. And you can also use Git for a more formal peer review and approval process. And all in all, I guess it's just a formal way of treating your critical workbooks that could allow you to eventually, hopefully, reduce errors in your spreadsheet. And so, as I was saying, I'm not going to give you like a full primer here on Git. I just wanted to make sure that I mentioned the few commands that are most common. Definitely, if you look at the middle here, it's git add, git commit, git push. That is if you use Git on the command line. That's really just to kind of add your changes like to the staging area, git add. Then git commit is actually, committing the changes and give the whole change set a message of what's really changed. That's kind of one of the most critical points. And then you push it to your remote, to GitHub, for example, or GitLab. And that's where other people can actually pull it again. So that's at the end. Git pull means you just take the changes from the remote, what other people pushed, and you merge it into your local Git repository. And then at the top, I have the diff command listed, which really is actually kind of the most important command almost, because it allows you, if you write source code, at least it allows you to see what's going on before you push a command, but then push a new version, but then obviously also after you push a new version. Me personally, I often use the diff command in that sense directly on the system like GitHub by looking at the pull request, but maybe more about that a little bit later. That's already it about the Git introduction. And so let's see, what are the issues really that we have when we use Git with Excel? So the first issue is that we can't just use git diff. Git will just, tell us it's a binary file and they differ. So it's as smart to recognize that, but it doesn't give us an additional information on top of that. So it's really what I hear from a lot of users. They don't want to use Git because it doesn't really add much to the initial tweet we saw, where you can version different files. It doesn't really give you the critical difference, the critical change viewer that usually you would get with Git. So that's one of the biggest issues. And the picture absolutely looks the same if you look at the hosted solutions. So for instance, in this picture here, you have GitHub, but it's absolutely the same over all the other providers. So all you can do is you can actually click on view raw, and that usually downloads the Excel file, but you will never be able to actually see what's going on within that file. So Git and GitHub and the likes, they just don't understand the Excel file format. And then the third issue we have out of the box is that Excel files can be very heavy. I'm on a regular basis talking to people who use 50 megabyte sheets or maybe 80 megabyte. That's really not so uncommon, especially if you work in finance. And Git, unlike, for example, Subversion, always locally downloads all the different versions that you have on your remote. So if you do a Git clone of a repository with Excel files, you will get the history. If you've been using it for 5 years and committing it on a regular basis, then you might have an issue. So it takes a very long time for the initial cloning. But it also, you can use up a substantial, storage space on your local hard drive. So that's something which isn't really nice with the defaults, how Git is set up. And we're going to see how we can actually improve that situation. And so I have this little example here. So 25 megabyte workbook, that's kind of a medium-sized workbook. And if you just do that on weekdays for a year, you will be greeted by 7 gigabyte on your local hard drive. And then if you have a couple of workbooks, you can see where this one is going. And then finally, a bigger issue with Git and Excel are merge conflicts. I guess merge conflicts are never really much fun. I've never heard of somebody who particularly enjoys to resolve merge conflicts. But the issue with Excel is that the merge conflicts happen more often, and they are also harder to resolve. So that really doesn't really play in our favor. But nevertheless, we're going to see at some strategies how we can resolve them, and also why, in what situations merge conflicts actually appear. And so that brings me to some golden rules, how I call them, of how you can, or what you should do when you start using Git with Excel. And I have seen, so this is kind of based on kind of anecdotal evidence, because I have seen quite a lot of people starting to use or trying out something like Git or GitHub to track the Excel files, but often they just get back to whatever they have on their local drive, which is often something like, my critical model underscore, then some author name and some date and some version tag. And then they just check this into Git without any change. And I would strongly suggest you to take out all the versioning tags and all the descriptive tags and leave alone the name of the Excel before adding it and committing and pushing it to Git. The reason for that is that Git really handles all these things for you in the background. So it gives every change a commit message. You will see who is the author. You will see the timestamp, and you will also be able to get a unique version hash, a unique version number. So these are all the things that Git will handle for you. So really just strip it down to the actual file name. Then a second rule I would suggest is to actually make good use of commit messages. So don't just upload a new file and then say updated, file X, but really describe what's going on in those changes, why you made new changes. That will help you dramatically in finding, a faulty commit. Like if for example there is a bug emerging at some point, this will tremendously help you find where that bug could have happened. So that's a really good advice, I believe, to really use description here, a good description of what happened, and you can be really detailed in that regard. And then another tip here is definitely use a git ignore file. A git ignore file, basically, you can add several files or several paths of files that should not be tracked in Git. And a very good idea if you use Excel is to block your temporary Excel files. And the screenshot here is not even like, I didn't make that up. It really happens as soon as you don't have that. If you don't pay close attention, you just do a quick git add, git push, you will definitely end up with temporary files on your Git instance. So very good advice. Use this here, this path here, and that will make sure that all of the Excel temporary files are going to be ignored, and you will be fine there. And then finally here, this is how I would suggest you release an Excel file. So when you do release an Excel file, you may actually have the need to still tag the file name directly with a version number. And that's a completely fair point to make if you want to send around the Excel file, or you want to drop it on your shared drive, for example, then that is an absolutely good idea. But the important part here is that you will not do it directly on your Git repository, but you will actually use the upload feature, or basically like the download area that pretty much all of the Git providers have. And so GitHub, for example, uses the release pages for that. And you can tag your repository, so you can always go back and see how was it at this point in time. And then what I would also recommend you to do is actually automate that process of uploading the tagged Excel file. And I'm going to quickly show you how you can do that in live. And so this here is a repository I made, including a GitHub Action. And the GitHub Action is the relatively new pipelines, automatic continuous delivery, continuous integration pipeline from GitHub. And it's incredibly easy to do really just that. So you see I have mybook.xlsx here, and I would just like to release a new version. So what I can do now is I can just go to the releases. I can draft a new release. All I have to do is put in a release number here. I say publish the release, and then that will trigger an automatic pipeline here that you can see starts off, and it'll just take a few seconds for it to run. And once that's done, and that is already the case, then when we go back to the releases here, you will see that it has now arrived as my book dash with the version number. And this is basically now, you know, what you can distribute through people. You can give them the link. Everybody who looks for it, they know, okay, I have to look in the release page. And you can be sure that the repository as such is untouched. You still have mybook.xlsx, but everybody who wants to download the file can do so from the release page, including the version number. So this is open source. I also made a blog post about it. The pipeline is really very simple. In essence, you can just really copy paste it if you use GitHub in any case. If you use another provider, then there's similar similar offerings, and it works kind of similar. You can do the similar thing there. So that's very quickly how this works. Here is also the link for like a more detailed or a blog for the explanations if you want to look into that. All right, so now we're going to get into the tools section, and one of the tools that you should definitely know about is Spreadsheet Compare. And Spreadsheet Compare is basically a tool which comes with most versions of Excel, most versions of Microsoft Office. And it allows you to compare two files. And so like if you have multiple versions of your Excel files, then it's actually a good idea to use that tool to see what has been changed in between versions. Again, you can actually hook the Spreadsheet Compare program up with your Git installation. And another blog post here describes how you can do it. But for now, I would just like to show you real quick how the Spreadsheet Compare program works. So like if you've never heard of it, then you could just go here and search for it. So if you have a version of Microsoft Office that covers it, then you will find it in here. So you can open it. It's a standalone application. And you can click on here, and then you could search for the files. And I've already done that before, so it keeps it. And I can simply click on OK. And this will load the two Excel workbooks side by side. And you can then see like a list of changes below here. You can also click on it and see like where certain things happen. What I don't really think it's kind of really well in a very modern way presented is the VBA part. If you double click the VBA part, it's kind of you feel like a bit thrown back to the 80s or 90s probably. But nevertheless, if you have a simple thing, it may serve you well. It also has a bit of you know, a bit of noise in the diffs. If you, for example, this one here would just be like an empty VBA module. So take it with a grain of salt, the VBA part here. But for the sheet part, it actually works quite nicely. You can also look at, for example, the calculated values, how they differ, and other things like added rows or columns. You can also start the Spreadsheet Compare directly from Excel if you have the Inquire add-in enabled. The Inquire add-in you can enable here under COM add-ins and then activate it. The developer tab, by the way, is also not visible right away, so you would have to go to the options and first make sure that you do have the developer tab enabled, and or otherwise go via here the add-ins menu. But you will know how to get to COM add-ins, and you can enable the Inquire add-in. And from here, you can again click on Compare Files. And for example, if you just have two files open, then it will automatically compare these two files. So depending a little bit on your workflow, this might be the faster and easier version to get your Spreadsheet Compare open with those two versions of the Excel file that may be of interest for your specific use case. All right, so we've just looked at that. And then I would like to show you briefly our own tool that we manage, which is called Excel Trail. And Excel Trail is a bit, you can think of it as a bit of a GitHub platform, but unlike GitHub, it does understand the Excel file. So it's really built for Excel files. And for the most important parts of Excel, like the formulas and the VBA code at the moment. And so to actually look at the same example as what we've just looked at before, I can pull this up here, and you can actually set up Excel Trails so it synchronizes with external Git repositories. That's one of the features that Excel Trail offers. You could also use it for like manual uploads via drag and drop, but for now, let's just have a quick look at a Git repository. So the one that the two files we were just looking at in the Spreadsheet Compare file was taken from this Compare Excel files repository on GitHub. And so you can look at the file here. You will see the components here, and then you can go on history, and you will see the commits. So this case here, I've just done two commits, a version 1 and a version 2, and then you can click on See Changes, and this will actually give you the overview of what changed within commit. So you will see the added sheet here, an empty added sheet, and you can also see that somebody here has changed a formula into a hard-coded value, and then also deleted a column and added some rows. And you can then also click on the full sheet to actually see that in the context. So you can really see how the sheet looks, and you can see again in green, like here, the added rows, and in red, the deleted rows. And here again, you can also click on the changes here. You will see again what changed within a cell. And so that kind of allows you to spot relatively easily if the changes you made were indeed the changes that you were intended to do. And this also allows you kind of to use the standard Git workflow. So somebody makes a set of changes, and then maybe just for themselves, they can have a look and kind of self peer review, but then also for a true peer review of having somebody from the team look at the changes and then maybe question things that look a bit off. And often what can happen, for example, is that you delete a column and you're not aware of that there was a hidden column somewhere or a hidden sheet that was referring to that specific cell you just deleted. And so that's kind of how you can easily introduce reference errors, for instance. And so this here really helps you to visualize anything that changed in a workbook and really just apply the standard Git workflow. And then below here, you can see that the VBA code that is inside that workbook is also displayed in very much the same way as you would look at code changes of a traditional coding language on a system like GitHub. And if you go back to basically the content view, you could also go into the content view directly and then also see what changed here on the level of the content. So that's a bit the added value here. Like if you have a lot of commits, then in that view, you would only see those commits who really affected a specific sheet. And so if, for example, you know that there is a something going on in a specific sheet, like an error or something, then that would help you kind of strip down to those commits that really just had an effect on that specific sheet or that specific VBA module. All right, so that's on a high level how ExcelTrail works and can help you to kind of look into the details what GitHub and the like block from you when you check in Excel workbooks in Git. Then we also manage a open source tool. It's also free, and it's called Git Excel. And Git Excel is, unlike ExcelTrail, is not a server or web-based application. It's a simple local Git extension. And what it can do is, if you do write VBA code, then it can locally give you the diff of the VBA code and also allows you to merge code right within the VBA editor. And so that is kind of helpful because you can truly use you can, like, different people, they can work on the same Excel workbook and can write VBA source code changes. And after that, you can automatically merge it. And if there is a merge conflict, you will clearly see it and be able to resolve it in the application in Excel, the VBA editor, right away. So how does Git Excel work? So in this screenshot, you see that if, for example, if you use Git on the command prompt, then you can just say, you can do some changes and then do git diff. And then you will get below, you will get the diff in green and red highlighted. And you can actually see that, for example, in this case, somebody changed the version number. Now, I know that not everybody is a big friend with the command prompt, especially not for Git. So what also works is to use source tree. And source tree is the GUI the GUI tool from Atlassian, the guys behind Bitbucket, which is also free to use. And the good part about it is that it really works out of the box without having to configure anything. So if you use source tree, then all you need to do is install Git Excel and off you go. So then you just select your uncommitted change, for example, or whatever previous commit, it doesn't matter. And then on the right side here at the bottom, you will see again the diffs in the VBA code. And a lot of people, it seems to be quite popular to the source tree application, and a lot of people, they do obviously prefer that over a bare bone command prompt where you have to scroll through a bigger diff. So I definitely can recommend that for VBA. If you do write VBA code, definitely a good idea to look into that combination, source tree plus Git Excel. Both are free, so definitely worth to give it a shot. Then, as I was mentioning, if you do run into a merge conflict in the VBA when you use Git Excel, what happens is it does merge your code right away in VBA, and it will mark it, using the same markers as you would see in a standard Git environment. And so by coincidence, it's also being formatted in red, which is really makes it easy to spot where your conflict happens. And so you can just pick the right version that you want to go with, and then delete those markers again. And then you can mark the conflict as resolved. And that's a very nice way of how you can really manage, for example, an add-in which only consists of VBA code. All right, so I have mentioned before that using a lot of files which are very big and you commit a lot of times will give you a very, very big repository just by the fact that git clone by default clones all the history of all time on your local device. And for this, there is another open source and free Git local Git extension, and it's called Git LFS for large file storage. There's the link for all the information. It's an extension which is developed by GitHub and Bitbucket and a lot of many other people, I'm sure, but I believe these are the initial the companies who initiated the Git LFS at the beginning. So what happens is that if you use Git LFS, then it will not download the big Excel files, not all of them, but it will only download the one that you are looking at. So it will substantially, bring down the size for your initial clone, and will help you to really make things a lot smoother if you have big Excel workbooks. If you have a repository which has a few smaller ones, which they get a commit like every couple of weeks, then probably it's not worth bothering. But if you have a serious heavy file, then definitely you should look into that. And the way it works to get started is it would it would require you to basically say git lfs track, and then basically again the kind of the characters that match the Excel files, all of them. So this will work for XLSX, for XLS, for XLSB, and so on. And so this here will define then that you will track all these files with Git LFS. Then a small side note below, Git is actually looking kind of to integrate such a feature natively, but it's still experimental at this point in time. And so how does Git LFS work? So if you say, for example, on the command line, git push origin master from a change that affects an Excel file, then you would see that Git LFS here is basically printing out a statement, and you can be sure that it works. But other than that, there is kind of, once you have set it up and once you have Git LFS installed locally, then there is nothing really that you have to think of anymore. So it just works normally. So you just do your git add, commit, git push, or you use your GitHub desktop or your Atlassian source tree, Bitbucket source tree application. It works like before, and it just takes care of that in the background. And now I would like to go through a couple of options you have when working with Git in general. But I was talking a lot about the command line. And if you use the command line, then that might be all you need. But many Excel users may not be such big friends with the command line. So there is, as we've already seen, there is tools like SourceTree. There is one from GitHub Desktop. They are free. There are many others, some of them paid. Here is a link with the overview of them. There is many you can choose from. Then there is also TortoiseGit. TortoiseGit, I guess Tortoise is very famous, was very, very famous for SVN subversion. They basically integrate in your file explorer, and you get like a green checkbox or check mark on top of your file. And then like if you have uncommitted changes, then it turns like yellow. And then if there's a merge conflict, it turns red. So that's another way of dealing with it. You can like right click and commit files. So a lot of people actually love that and use that because it just kind of is more natural to how they work with files on Windows. And then naturally, there is also, if you're used to working with an IDE or something, then there is always, most of the time, I guess, there is an integrated way to work with Git. So for example, if you use VS Code or something, Visual Studio for other code, then you could obviously also use this to commit your Excel workbooks to GitHub. Then you can also use drag and drop for committing new files to GitHub. And funny enough, that kind of works in all of the big providers, GitHub, GitLab, Azure DevOps. But last time I checked, Bitbucket didn't really support that. But drag and drop is kind of is probably almost the easiest thing. So like if you have somebody who like only very seldomly has to check in a new version, then maybe a drag and drop interface directly on the web platform of your Git provider may be a good idea to look into that also. So a couple of different options here, really, from the command line to drag and drop. And that brings us to the merge conflicts that I was initially saying happen more often and are harder to resolve than if you just write, traditional source code in text, normal text files. And just to kind of make this clear, merge conflicts in Git, they happen even if you are the only person who works on that repository, and even if you just have like a single file and you have a single branch, you just use master all the time, it can still happen. And an example I have is at the bottom. So like, if you work in at work on a repository, and then you come home in the evening, and before you forget to issue a pull command, you start working locally, and then you want to commit and push, and that will also give you a merge conflict. So it's a really good idea to kind of familiarize yourself with when they happen, why they happen, and how you can resolve them. And so I was saying that merge conflicts, they do happen more often with Excel files than with normal files. And so here we can actually see when they happen and why. So on the left-hand side, you can see basically master branch, and then here you branch off and do a few commits on your branch here. And then at this point, you would like to merge back to master. And this is never an issue. This is not an issue with text files. This is not an issue with Excel files, because practically speaking, you're just on a theoretical branch. You're just pushing everything over again, and that's it. So Git calls that a fast forward merge. It's really just putting the history from that branch over to master. Nothing complicated. Master has not changed since you branched off into a separate branch. But the picture is different here on the right-hand side. So from the moment on where you branched off into a separate branch, somebody has made another commit to master. And so this could happen because somebody really directly committed to master, but it could also happen because, you know, somebody had another branch, and while you are working on my branch here, that other person has merged this branch onto master and then also introduced another new commit. And so that's really the situation which will cause issues, because as soon as master has changed from when you were creating your branch, this will always create a merge conflict, unfortunately, when you deal with Excel files. In text files, with text files, I would say most of the time Git will know how to merge. So even though this situation, you know, happens with text source files, Git will know what to do. So like only like if you change the very same line of code, you will end up in a merge conflict, and then you will have to resolve that manually in Git. But with Excel files, you know, you can change completely independent things in the Excel file. Like somebody is just changing here sheet 1, and then you are just changing sheet 2. It doesn't matter. Git doesn't know what's going on. It just sees that both files have changed. They have both changed in both branches, and so there is a merge conflict to be resolved. It could also be you just like resave your file and check it back in, and you don't even have changes, and that will already cause a merge conflict. So how can we deal with that situation? So there's a couple of different strategies you can use. The first strategy is file locking, and the easiest way to go about that is really just doing an informal file locking. So you may be used to file locking if you use SharePoint, for example, to work on your Excel workbooks. So when you check out a file from SharePoint, it actually does block it by default. And so others, they cannot check it out at the same point in time. An easy solution here would be like, you know, just use your chat. Now, I guess if everybody works from home more than ever, and if you do that, then it can work. It depends a little bit on your setup, obviously. Another more formal way of dealing with it would be to use Git LFS that we've just introduced before. So Git LFS actually does include a file locking mechanism. And the good part about it is that meanwhile, it wasn't the case like a year ago. Meanwhile, all major providers like GitHub, GitLab, and so on, they do actually provide that feature. And the other thing, though, that happens with file locking via Git LFS is that, well, you do have to remember two things. First of all, you do have to lock the file. You have to issue the command. And also, before you lock it, you still have to pull the file. So if you do not get the latest changes from the server, if you forget that, then you will still be presented with potentially a merge conflict. And so to use Git LFS and make, you know, enable basically the file locking through Git LFS, you would have to issue the command here at the bottom. So Git LFS track, and then, you know, -- lockable to indicate that these are the type of files that are that you want to be locked from Git LFS. And this is a little use case how this would look in Git LFS. So you start by acquiring a lock. You say, okay, I'm going to work on that workbook, and you will just say Git LFS lock and whatever the name of the book is, and you can see then if you're successfully acquiring the lock. If nobody else has locked it, then you will get the confirmation here that the book is locked. And then the next person who will try to also lock the file will get a warning, and you know, they will be notified and they know, okay, the lock cannot be acquired, and you can actually then, you know, check who has locked it, and you can then see that it was me who is currently locking the file. And then I guess, you know, you would probably get back to chat and say, hey, are you gonna, you know, lock it for much longer? And whenever I'm done, I just do Git LFS unlock and the file is unlocked again. So that's kind of a formal way how Git through Git LFS enables you to use a locking mechanism. So yeah, it's one way to solve the issue. It's kind of, you know, work around it. Then if you want to do a true Git workflow though, so like use multiple branches, and so maybe a person works on one branch and then another person works on a different branch, then this is what it kind of looks like. So as I said, as soon as a person commits to master and then you would like to merge back before that, like on a version that was before the new commit on master, you will get into a merge conflict. So it's a really good idea to know how we can solve them. And so you see here the commands I made. We are on the master branch. Obviously, it works the same if you are on source tree, on another GUI application. You issue the git merge command, and then you will get the message that it is a merge conflict. So what can you do now? And I found that one of the easiest way to go from here is basically that you use git merge tool as a command. And git merge tool will produce the following for you. It will create like a ton of files. It will create 4 files on top of your original file. And you can ignore most of them. The only 2 that you are interested in is the original file here. So this is basically the file from the branch you are on. So in our example where we tried to merge the branch into master, this will be the master version. And then the other file you're interested in has the remote here in the file name. And this is our basically our the file version from the branch. And so this is just kind of an easy hack, if you want, to get without like undoing the merge, or without like having to manually copy the file from the other branch, go back and so on, or using stashes and so on. It's an easy way to get those 2 versions of the files next to each other. And you also don't need to rename them to be able to open them simultaneously in Excel. So I found it a good way to deal with the situation. So at this point, you can actually, you know, take those 2 files and you can stick it into Spreadsheet Compare. You can obviously also use Excel Trail. Excel Trail already has support for different branches, and then you can compare directly across branches. And that way you would actually not even have to do this part. So if you use Excel Trail, then you can, as soon or as long as you have pushed those branches to your GitHub repository, then you will be able to compare those different branches directly in Excel Trail without having to do this manual work locally. But nevertheless, it can actually be useful to then, you know, if you know the changes, if you look at them by either using Spreadsheet Compare or Excel Trail, or maybe you have another tool to compare those files, or maybe you sit together with the other person who made those changes on the other branch, then you can kind of go through the different sheets. You can have them side by side. You can copy paste maybe the sheet that was changed in this version. You can copy it over to the other file, and that's how you can manually resolve the merge conflict. It's still cumbersome, but if you do decide to go that route of getting into merge conflicts by not preventing them through like a file locking, then that is a way how you can resolve it. And from what I hear from users I'm talking to, it kind of can work, but it's definitely useful if you start to do smaller changes. So instead of working a full day on an Excel workbook and committing really big chunks of changes in the end, you can basically really cut it down to smaller chunks, and then that definitely helps you when it comes to merge conflicts. Again, we have some more material here on the blog. You can definitely check it out and see in a bit more detail, I guess, to see how how it's done as a kind of instructions in these blog posts. And with that, I am at the end of this little overview. And I'm always happy to connect on LinkedIn, so feel free to reach out to me here. And other than that, as I said, I mentioned it a couple of times during the presentation, we do have quite a bit of material on the topic on our blog. You can scroll through that. There is a lot of Git plus Excel topics covered. So make sure to have a look at this.